at Ankara in 1402, breaking the Ottomans into two. The Ottomans would recover, so would India, but the Middle East would struggle for another 100 years. It was no longer the home of the Caliphate, as the Abbasid Caliph had moved to Cairo after the sack of Baghdad by the Mongols. All of its artisans and scholars had moved outwards as well, to either Egypt, Anatolia, or India. All three of them were ruled by Turks. At this point, you can say that Islam went from being a civilization to being a collection of civilizations. Before this time, being a Muslim in Spain was largely the same as being a Muslim in Iran. Not exactly, but largely. Although now that would change as Islam would expand to distant places like sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Let's get back to the story. Remember those Ottomans that Timur had broken in two? Well, they came back in a big way after putting their empire together. They had already broken into Eastern Europe. In 1453, they did the impossible and captured Constantinople, ending the Byzantine Empire once and for all. The Ottomans kept expanding in both directions, east and west. In the east, around 1500, a new Shia dynasty called the Safavids rose up and quickly took over Persia, which had been unstable almost since Timur's death. The Safavids directly challenged the Ottomans for dominance in Anatolia, but were pushed back by the Ottoman Sultan Selim, who thought, while I'm in the area, I might as well visit Egypt. I mean, people always say that if you're in the area, you should visit Egypt, and then he did. He took over Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, as well as the title of the Caliph. For the first time in almost 900 years, the title of the Caliph was held by a non-Arab. In the west, the empire grew into Greece, the Balkans, and along both banks of the Danube. It reached Vienna, where it lost the siege of Vienna twice. The Ottoman army was a formidable force, thanks in no small part to being one of the first non-Chinese empires to use gunpowder. On top of everything, the empire produced at least 10 great consecutive rulers, all of whom were men of considerable skill in civil and military administration. Also, they developed a good bureaucratic system, which was fueled by the Devshirme. So basically, the Ottomans took Christian boys, by force if needed, converted them to Islam, and trained them to take over various roles in the government and military. The empire hit its peak around 1683. While it slowly declines and collapses onto itself, let's check in on the East. After the collapse of the Timurid dynasty in Persia, there was a constant battle between various Turco-Persian groups until from Azerbaijan, a young, charismatic man named Ismail rose up. And young is right. He was around 12 or 14 when he seized most of Persia and labeled himself Shah in 1501. The title of Shah hadn't been used since the first wave of the Islamic conquests under the Rashidun in the 630s. The new dynasty, the Safavids, as I mentioned before, developed a rivalry with the Ottomans as they were Shias and the Ottomans were Sunnis. The Safavids pushed Shiism on their subjects, even forcing conversions on Sunnis, Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians. They too used a slave army because, that had worked so well for the previous empires. Under the brilliant Shah Abbas the Great, the empire prospered and turned into another gunpowder empire. After him, the empire fell into something of a hidden decay. Both of its rivals, the Ottomans and the Mughals in India, were busy elsewhere, and its borders were pretty much secure, so it seemed like the empire was strong, but it wasn't, as it was made so rudely obvious by an undisciplined Afghan tribal army who broke the Safavids and captured their capital city of Isfahan, which was a shock to everyone involved, including the Afghans. The Safavids were turned into puppets controlled by the Afghans until one man by the name of Nadir Shah rose up and captured Isfahan in 1730. He installed a new Safavid puppet on the throne as well, but got tired of the system and crowned himself in 1736, ending the Safavid dynasty. He proved to be a mix of Napoleon, Timur, and Stalin. He was an effective but brutal ruler, and he was assassinated in 1747. As Nadir Shah did in 1739, let's now head to India. As I mentioned before, Timur's empire broke apart and many Timurid princes tried to build their own realms. However, all but one failed. The one that didn't fail, Babur, couldn't build this empire in Persia or Central Asia, so he headed to India, where he defeated the Lodi dynasty of the Delhi Sultanate in 1526, taking over major portions of North India and Afghanistan. After surviving one minor road bump under his son, the empire grew and became the dominant force in India. India was different than most areas under Muslim control because it was here that the Muslims made up the smallest portion of the population. The local Hindus were reluctant to convert, but that changed with the Mughals as they brought Sufism with them. Mughals became great patrons of science, art, and architecture. Most of their rulers were also very tolerant of the local population, although the empire hit its peak under Aurangzeb. The Mughals became the last of the three so-called gunpowder empires, none of which primarily spoke Arabic, but rather mostly spoke Persian. Around its peak, the Mughal Empire was home to around 150 million people, second only in the world to China. A combination of unending wars of conquest in the south that depleted the empire's monetary resources, wars of succession that depleted the empire's human resources, and Nadir Shah's sack of Delhi in 1739, which depleted everything, culminated in the rapid decline of the empire. By 1757, the empire was a puppet to the great Marathas who had risen up in the south. The same year, they had lost the Battle of Plassey, which would become one of the most important battles in human history. This enemy was not local. It was an unexpected force known as the British East India Company. Okay, let's take one final step back. Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese explorer, landed in India in 1498 by traveling around the African continent. The Europeans now had a permanent trade route to India that didn't go through the increasingly hostile Muslim Middle East. This had significant consequences for the Middle East as their trade route dried up. Now, Islam had been consolidating in Eastern Africa since shortly after the Prophet's death, when Egypt was conquered. Merchants and scholars brought Islam up the Nile all the way to the Swahili coast. Significant ports were established all the way to Zanzibar and Mozambique, which by the way is named after a Muslim man called Musa ibn Biq. These Muslim states, the Fanj Sultanate being a prominent one, became somewhat Arabized through constant contact with the Arab world through trade. Among other things, ivory and slaves were traded here. When the Portuguese came, they conquered and sacked these coastal cities to establish dominance in the Indian Ocean. This trade in the Indian Ocean had previously been a monopoly of the Arabs, which they used to trade all the way from Africa to China. On the other side of the African continent, Islam was also flourishing, again having arrived there with merchants and scholars who traveled to cities such as Timbuktu and Gao, trading salt, gold, and slaves. By the 14th century, Islam had become the dominant religion in sub-Saharan West Africa along the Atlantic coast. This gave birth to, among others, the Mali Empire, and perhaps the richest man in all of history, Mansa Musa, who became famous after visiting Mecca with thousands of camels loaded with gold in 1324. As the 16th century came about, both West and East African Muslim states came into conflict with European powers who wanted to control every single drop of trade between China, India, the Middle East, Africa, and of course, the New World. Muslim and Arab monopoly over the entire North African and pan-Saharan trade was broken, leading to the destabilization of many empires in both Africa and Asia. The first European power, as I mentioned, was the Portuguese, who came to control major port cities along the Atlantic coast of Africa and the Indian Ocean. Most naval trade from China went through the Malay archipelago, which by this time had quite a bit of Muslims, thanks to nearly 1,000 years of trade with Muslims. These Muslims had arrived as merchants and had settled in various coastal cities in Southeast Asia. They accumulated a lot of wealth and hence a lot of power. First, they entered royal courts as ministers, and then they started building their own sultanates, the Sultanate of Malacca and the Sultanate of Brunei being among the very first. The arrival of the Europeans and their brutal domination of the area led to increased Islamization of the archipelago, as Muslim noblemen led the resistance against the Europeans and many people joined them. This resistance was the bridge that locals used to convert to Islam. By the end of the 16th century, the Portuguese controlled most of the trade through Africa and the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese were able to do this thanks to two very significant technological advancements. First, better sails, and second, better cannons. Forts in the Islamic world had better cannons than the Europeans, but not the navy. The fact that no one in the region had a significant navy to begin with helped as well. Also, this trade being redirected took a significant toll on the economies of Muslim empires. These innovations, along with New World silver, combined with the fact that by the year 1700, the three Muslim empires that controlled everything between Bengal, in what is today Bangladesh, and the Danube were in decline, leaving a vacuum of power that the Europeans were eager to fill. Now, there are a million explanations for this decline, but at least in two of these three empires, the Mughals and the Ottomans, a big reason was untrained rulers succeeding the throne as a result of courtly intrigue rather than their usual method of proving themselves in the battlefield, often against their brothers. The French, the British, the Dutch, and the Spanish entered the colonization stage in the 17th century and displaced the Portuguese, looking to fill the power vacuum and jumpstart the era of colonization. From 1700 to 1900, most of the Islamic world came under the control of European powers. India was completely taken over by the British by the 1850s after they defeated the fragmented Indians and also the French who were trying to gain ground in India. The Dutch took over the Malay archipelago where they disrupted production in a devastating way. The Russian Empire expanded into the Muslim Transcaucasia and Central Asia. This eventually culminated in 50 million Muslims living in the Soviet Union. The British took over Egypt and the Sudan, while the French took control of Algeria, Tunisia, and other West African countries. Obviously, there were various resistance movements against European imperialism. These were led by charismatic leaders who often belonged to Sufi or other religious orders and led some bands of warriors tied together by tribal or religious ties. In addition to resistance, there was also reformation. To many Muslims, the reason that the Europeans won was that Muslims had lost God's favor, and so reform was required. Some of these movements advocated for Islam to adapt to modern circumstances and learn from the Europeans, while the other asked for, quote, a return to Allah. Among these, the Wahhabi are the most infamous. Many of these reformist movements are still around in different forms and capacities. The tale of the development of Islam is a story for another time, but do check out Almost Wise's video on the topic. Okay, let's now return to the Ottoman Empire, which had lost most of its European territory between 1700 and 1900. When World War I broke out, it controlled only Anatolia, Syria, Palestine, and some parts of Arabia. It had had a pretty dramatic meltdown over modernizing and was now known as the sick man of Europe. It joined the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, which turns out was the wrong side. They were defeated and the Ottoman borders were slashed to only Anatolia, which the Allies actually wanted to divide further, just like they had with the previously Ottoman Middle East, but Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was able to fend them off and retain the Turkish core of the country and founded a new country, a republic, formally ending the Ottoman Empire in 1922. In 1924, the office of the Caliph was finally formally abolished, ending the chain of caliphs that went back 1300 years, all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad himself. Atatürk served as the first president of the Republic of Turkey and led a secularization effort, the success of which is still too early to talk about. In the early 1900s, the British legally separated Indian Muslims and the people they called Hindus. This led to Muslims and Hindus dividing into different camps regarding the fate of the Indian subcontinent after the British left. Some Muslims and some Hindus wanted a Hindu India and a Muslim Pakistan, composed of, respectively, the Hindu majority areas and the Muslim majority areas. The other Muslims and the other Hindus wanted a secular state which would be home to every ethnicity and religion that called India its home. In 1947, after the Second World War, the British left India after dividing it between a Hindu majority India and a Muslim majority Pakistan. As the borders were rather arbitrary, it led to conflict between the two states that culminated in some 3 wars and East Pakistan becoming an independent country called Bangladesh. Although Pakistan did a pretty good job alienating its eastern half on its own. Pakistan turned into an Islamic republic, while India, with its significant Muslim population, continues to be a secular republic. The success of this secular democracy is also a little too early to talk about. Fingers crossed. It's gonna be fine. I'm sure, although things are not really looking good. It's gonna be okay, I'm sure. Down to this day, Pakistan and India continue to be hostile. The Muslims under the former Russian Empire were consolidated further into Moscow's fold after the Bolshevik Revolution. During the 1930s, Stalin cracked down on Muslims under his rule and even practically outlawed Islam. He also divided Central Asia into rather arbitrary borders to break a potential sense of unity among the people there. He even moved Muslims around during the Second World War because he didn't trust them. Well, he didn't trust anyone, to be honest. Fast forward to the 1980s, when the Soviet Union tried to expand into Afghanistan, but failed when the US, along with the people Rambo 3 thanked, stopped them. As the Soviet Union's power declined, Islam saw a resurgence in Central Asia. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, 5 republics came into existence: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Although there are still local independence movements by Muslims in parts of Russia, the most famous being in Chechnya. Plus, there's a small chunk of Muslims living in Ukraine called the Tatars. The Pashtun Empire of Ahmad Shah Durrani was founded around 1747 when he gathered Pashtun tribes to form a confederacy. This laid the foundation for Afghanistan. Though by the time the 19th century rolled around, the Durranis were gone and Afghanistan was now the ground for the great game between the Russians and the British. In 1880, the British installed it as a buffer state between the Russians and their crown jewel, India. The Emirate of Afghanistan was established with Amir Abdur Rahman, who started the modernization of his country. It was under his grandson that Afghanistan finally gained complete autonomy and continued with modernization. Though this had a reaction from the conservatives who overthrew him in 1929. The Kingdom of Afghanistan served as a pawn during the Cold War, and tensions kept building with its neighbors and within it, leading to the Soviet invasion of 1979. The US propped up religious fundamentalists known as the Mujahideen against the Soviets. While they were able to fight and push the Soviets back, they also took over the country. The rest I'm sure you know. After the Safavids, the Qajar took over Iran in 1789. While it didn't come under the direct control of European powers, it was heavily under the influence of Britain and Russia, which most of the time didn't see eye to eye. Europeans have had an interest in Iran since 1908, when oil was first discovered in the country. As you'd expect, the Qajar bending over backwards for the Europeans wasn't popular at all, so local religious and political leaders forced the Shah to implement something of a constitutional monarchy, though this project was ended when the Russians intervened and restored the Shah's autocracy in 1911. The Qajar were eventually overthrown by the Pahlavis, who, for the most part, tried to modernize the country, but were also subservient to the Europeans and later the Americans. By this point, the country was quite democratic and even elected a prime minister, the famous Muhammad Mossadegh, in 1952, who was overthrown by the CIA when he tried to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company. This blatant disregard for the will of the Iranian people culminated in them uniting behind a religious leader named Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. This led to the Islamic Revolution of 1979, which